It looks good, Aaron. Thank you.
Perfect. Yeah, so I'll let Carla get started, but one of the things that has become very popular on these webinars, Scott, as you know, is the question about CEUs for certified crop advisors. So all of our past webinars have been approved for CEUs, and this one is going through the process to be to get CEUs as well. So we fully anticipate that CEUs will be granted. If you would like to have your CCA number accounted for on the CEUs, please shoot us a quick note by email, your name and your CCA number, and we will take care of everything else for you. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Carla, and she's going to get started, and you guys get to listen to me later on.
Thanks, Aaron. Good morning, everyone. And thanks again for taking part and joining us today. I'm Carla Jackson. I'm Veritas Market Development Agronomist, and I'm presenting with Aaron here, who is the General Manager. And today we'll be discussing fungicides and the decision to use them in unpredictable weather. So quickly, just looking at today's agenda, we'll be looking at the importance of the disease cycle, the agronomic benefits, timing, the use of the imagery, how to use it, and creating the prescriptions, and then most importantly, the validation portion of prescriptions. And then we'll open it up for questions at the end. When considering utilizing any Decision Ag solutions, there's 4 areas that you must look at, and they're important to ensure that the applied methods that you're working with will work. The first step is to identify. You want to identify any of the issues in your field, nutrient deficiencies through soil sampling, or if you're doing any scouting, you see that there's any pest issues as well. The next step is then to measure it using imagery, or you're using your scouting, or you're creating management zones to then measure those differences in your field. You then follow that up with managing. How do you manage that? Are you writing prescriptions? Are you using any scouting, site-specific scouting, things like that? And the final step, which is where a lot of the ag industry today doesn't quite fully incorporate just yet, is the validation area. And that's where we're trying to work with growers and agronomists and ag retails across North America to help provide that validation piece, where we're able to analyze those prescriptions that you've created to see if what you're actually doing to manage those issues are working, and also looking at your nutrient levels, making sure those are working well, and then also looking at your ROI as well for your management. I'll now hand it over to Aaron, who's going to look at the agronomic benefits of the fungicides as well as the disease control and stress management.
Thanks, Carla. So as Carla introduced me, introduced myself, I'm the General Manager of the Veritas division of Deveron. So we're the data insights part of Deveron. So Deveron obviously does data collection as well as data insights. So it's we can assist in collecting the data, and we can also assist in what we call figuring out what the so what is around the data. So my background is I've been an agronomist for about 20 years now, and working with a variety of different crops. I think my last number that I added up was something like 47 different crops. So lots of interesting things that I've had in my past. So I'm going to share some of that bit. I quantify that experience because, well, I'm not the biggest fan of my job title of general manager. I much prefer being an agronomist. First up, fungicides. The big reason for fungicides, when we think about it, is all around disease control, specifically the fungus diseases. So one of the big concepts that we will talk about when we're talking about fungicides and diseases is this concept of a disease cycle. Every disease has its own unique disease cycle. Some of them are very similar and some of them are very different. The one that I particularly like to pick on, because it's one that we've had the most experience with on our selective fungicides, is white mold. So this is sclerotia. Sorry, my Latin is somewhat limited, so you can You can read the Latin name. But this is a massive disease. It's worldwide. There is over 400 different host plants for this. So whether it's soybeans or edible beans or sunflowers or canola, it's a massive number of plants that can be affected by this disease. And one of the challenges with this disease is there's a lot of broadleaf weeds that are also susceptible to it. So even if you're not growing a crop that is susceptible to white mold, you may have weeds in your field that are allowing the population to build up of the disease. In this particular disease cycle, I won't spend a lot of time on it, but the disease resides in the soil. And when the conditions are ideal, and that's usually canopy closure, so you got a nice bit of moisture in the canopy, there's humidity, you have the sclerotia, they actually germinate, and they form tiny little fruiting bodies. To make things easy, we'll call them mushrooms. And from there, it fires off a whole bunch of spores into the rest of the canopy. The reason that's important is in the rest of that canopy, you have plant material that's starting to decay. So in the case of edible beans and soybeans, that's the flowers. And so it lands on that and then starts to cause infection, and that's what actually will take the plant down. So this is this particular disease cycle. Every disease cycle is unique, thinking that this is going to be the one that's going to work for southern leaf rust or tar spot. Each one's different, and understanding the disease cycle is important to understand how to get the most bang for your buck on the fungicides. Most fungicides are protective, meaning that you have to get the fungicide on before the disease really gets started. So, topic number one, fungicides. And they are definitely going to help you on disease management. The next part around the disease management, we talk about what is called the disease triangle. And the disease triangle, what it basically means is that you have to have all three things present in order for the disease to occur. So you need to have the pathogen. So we were picking on white mold. So the white mold has to be present in the soil. If there is no white mold in the soil, which is very, very rare, you're not going to get the disease. Same with the host. For example, corn is not susceptible to white mold. So if you've got corn in your field, you don't have to worry about white mold. Likewise, on the host, even variety can have some sensitivities. So some varieties are more susceptible than others. So you need to be able to understand that you have to have both the pathogen and the host. And then the final one, and this is the one that changes and it's very hard for us to predict, is you have to have that favorable environment. So that can be your air temperatures, your fertility levels, rainfall. The fertility levels has a lot of interest for us. We're actually building some more tools to understand how soil fertility, soil type starts to influence the effectiveness of the fungicide. So something to, I guess that's called burying the lead or throwing a teaser out there. So something you guys have to stay in touch with us because it's going to be a lot of fun when we crack that one. And we are very close. So once we get some yield data in, we'll be able to start to publish some stuff there. Here's the other thing about fungicide. This is the part that has really started to take off. Obviously, if you've got the disease, fungicides is going to help if it's a fungal disease. If it's a viral disease, it's not going to matter. So, stress management. This is something that came out, I'm going to say, we first started talking about it maybe 10 to maybe even as much as 15 years ago, where certain classes of fungicide seem to be able to reduce the plant stress. It was marketed as a stay green or a plant health effect. Even without the disease there was getting to be a yield bump. And so the question was, well, what is going on there? So we've actually done some work with one of the companies that was at the forefront of this, BASF, with some of their strobilurin type chemistry. And so we've stolen some of their, or gently borrowed some of their stuff from their slide decks. and we'll definitely give them a shout out. The first one is that they have found that they're able to help manage the stomata. So for those of you who don't remember your botany class, the stomata, those are the cells usually on the underlayer side of the leaf. There is some on the top that open and close and allow for gas exchange within the leaf. So in order to have photosynthesis, you have to be getting rid of the oxygen. You have to be bringing in carbon dioxide. So the stomata help on that. If the plant is extremely dry or just suffering from drought, the stomata tend to stay closed, so that way they're less likely to lose moisture. However, when that happens, you reduce the photosynthetic efficacy. The next one is it reduces the amount of ethylene. Now, ethylene is basically, it is a gas that causes a lot of plants to mature faster. So it allows things to ripen. So the classic example that I always think of is bananas. So ethylene causes bananas to turn yellow. So it's the same way in a lot of our field crops, that ethylene production causes the plant to speed up its life cycle. The faster it goes through its life cycle, the less time it has to build grain. So the less time it has to build yield. So by reducing the ethylene, you allow that plant to keep increasing the amount of grain. And then the final one is around nitrogen assimilation. When the plant's not under stress, it's able to assimilate nitrogen. I see we have David Reinhardt on the call today, and David's been a great resource for myself, understanding how nitrate is taken up into the plant and how it assimilates through the cycle to be able to form protein. So by reducing the amount of stress, you actually improve that nitrogen assimilation. So as you can see, 3 really interesting things that have absolutely nothing to do with disease. Here's an example. Like I said, we borrowed it from BASF, some of the work that we've done going all the way back to 2004. So yeah, 16 years ago that they started doing some work. And this is side by side using soybeans. And you can see certain years when there was stress on the plant, that was when the biggest average increase, right? Like if you go back to 2007, and I remember 2007, that was a very droughty year. Maybe not quite as bad as 2011, but for this part of the area, it was very droughty and a significant increase. Like if you're averaging a 6 bushel increase, wow. Same with when 2005, that was the last really bad aphid year that we had in the area that I was working in. So you can see when the plant is stressed, that is when when BASF is seeing the biggest bang for the buck. Here, switching to corn. Corn is not as big of a bump year after year on the droughty and the stressed years, but you can start to see that even with drought, there is some cases. Now, what's interesting with corn is what you will often see is other diseases will be coming in, whether it's tar spot, northern corn leaf blight, stripe rust, or not stripe rust, southern rust. It becomes much more of a challenge in corn that what you're going after is some of those diseases as well. When we're working with diseases in soybeans and dry beans, the big one that we're chasing usually is white mold. Later in the season, we can get into frog eye leaf spot as well. There's a picture. You can see that it does have an effect on the drought stress, that stay green effect. What's interesting with corn is usually setting the number of rows around its cob around the V5 to V6 stage. So if you stress your corn out at that 5 to 6 leaf stage, you are going to usually have less number of rows around the cob. When you get into the usually starting about the V12, maybe even the V10 stage, all the way up to basically just as the tassel is about to come out, and obviously during pollination, that is when you're determining how long that ear is. And obviously during the tasseling and pollination, making sure you have good tip fill. So if you have the plant stressed, and in the part of the world that I'm in today, we're probably, I'm going to say, yeah, 7 to 10 days away from corn starting to pollinate. So we're right in that critical time period when we're going to start to see some stress on making sure that the corn is setting ear that is going to be long enough and take full advantage of pollination when we're out getting some fungicide on the corn. So switching back to soybeans. Soybeans is my favorite crop because, well, it's a challenge. Trying to get a consistent response is really, really difficult. So going back to 2011, when we were doing some work to understand how soybeans were responding to fungicide, what we did was we went out and we collected a bunch of random soybean plants, not just from one field. We collected them from all over the region. And what we were doing was trying to figure out where along the plant was the majority of the soybean pods. So what we did was, if you know soybeans, some soybean plants, you have the pods that are on the nodes. Some plants you'll have 5 nodes, some of them you will have 15. So trying to normalize that was a bit of a challenge. So what we did, and you can see this along the x-axis, this is the horizontal one, that is the percentile of the stem. So if you are looking at about 50%, that's the middle of the stem. 75%, that's the top part of the plant, and then obviously down at 25%, that's the lower quarter. Anything below 25% is the lower quarter. The other thing that we did then was I literally counted the number of pods at every node. And I figured out, okay, what is the average number of pods per node? And then we graphed out, okay, if that's the number of average pods per node, is there more or less at any one node? You can see in 2011, we did this on 535 plants. We got an interesting curve. And the reason that I thought it was an interesting curve is because I was always taught to believe that the soybeans, it was the last top cluster was important. And you can see there is a upswing in the last little bit of the soybean cluster, that top cluster. I've heard them called the Vegas beans, because if you get them, you get to go to Vegas, or you get to go to Florida. They may be called Florida beans. But it was an interesting curve, so we repeated it in 2012, and I upped my game a little bit. And you can see that. Yes, that is 4,375 plants, and counted every pod. So there is a lot of pods. You can see I've indicated where that R2 stage is happening. Very interesting curve year after year, 2 very different years. 2011 was extremely dry for us. 2012 was very wet, but that curve was consistent. So it's right around the bottom quarter of the stem does not seem to be as important. It's that second, what would that be for my stats friends? So that'd be the second quartile of the stem seems to be the most important. So 25 to 50% of the stem. Here's why it's important. Everybody wants to have, if you think about it, if we can put 1 extra bean on per plant, so 1 pod, 1 extra bean. And if we had a population of 165,000 plants per acre, for those of you that are math wizards, 1 times 165,000 is 165,000 beans. I took an average 2,750 seeds per pound, and you divide that 165,000 by that number, and you come up with, wow, look at that, 60 pounds or 1 bushel. So 1 extra bean, just 1 bean, is going to give you an extra bushel. Now, imagine if you can save an extra pod or 2. Soybeans will abort between, I've seen numbers as low as 60% of their flowers, and I've seen numbers as high as 85% of the flowers will not form a pod. So if you can just save 1 or 2 flowers, you're adding up 5 to 6 bushels pretty darn quick. We actually looked at that data from 2011 and 2012, and you can see that a combination treatment, and I'll explain what the combination treatment is. When it's sprayed at that R2, we were getting 2.5 extra pods. Going later, which was up to that point, our traditional way of thinking, we were only gaining an extra 1/4 pod. So Earlier timing on fungicides on soybeans has been a huge boom for us. Now, keys to soybean success, and before I hand it over, and these are truly hard-learned lessons. One is about timing. We talk about an R1.7, an R2, early R2 stage. Realistically, if you're starting to see flat pods on the soybeans, you're too late. You want to be on before that. So a lot of guys that I work with, they've just started to spray this week. So I'm starting to see it happen. This is a little bit earlier this year. We had good planting conditions, so soybeans are off to the races. The next is water volume. For those of you who run aerial application, you're not going to be happy with this. Our research has shown 22 gallons per acre is the magic spot. With 20 gallons does seem to work sometimes. 22 seems to be the one gets us the consistent response. For those of you who want to go 10, 12, or 15 gallons, we just don't see the consistent response. Here's the other thing that I truly, truly believe in is adding in a monopotassium phosphate. This is a greenhouse grade fertilizer product. I think I've got the analysis, yeah, 05234. There's a bunch of different products out there that will use a monopotassium phosphate, and they all seem to be equally effective. Definitely encourage you to be adding in the monopotassium phosphate into the mix. With that, I believe I'm going to hand it back to Carla.
All right, thanks, Aaron. So now the last half of the presentation is going to be looking at imagery and then also using that towards creating the fungicide prescription once you've gone through and done some scouting and analysis there. We use imagery a lot, but we like to stress that imagery is valuable when it's used with a purpose. We can use imagery for multiple things, such as zone creation and script creation, which we're talking about today. Specifically using imagery to create selective spraying fungicide scripts. They can also be used for creating variable rate nitrogen, which is just wrapped up in some areas, and then also yield estimation, which will be taking place in the coming weeks here. Imagery can also be used, as Aaron had already talked about, as crop stress. So they can be used to identify some of the stressed areas, whether it's created by disease or pest or weather impacts. It can also be used for weed pressure, looking at herbicide drift, winter kill, or frost damage, or many other things such as tile runs. This is an NDVI image of a soybean field from last year. The green is the thicker, fuller vegetation, which is the risk for white mold. Red is the thinner stands. But when you're using NDVI, don't just look at the colors, because when you look at that, you think green's really good, red's really bad. But you have to look at the NDVI index. You'll see on this one, the bottom right, that the yield or the NDVI index is 0.8 to about 0.93. That's not a lot of variability in this field. So it's very important to work with your agronomist to walk your field, do some ground truthing, walk the areas to see where you're comfortable with actually spraying. Is you're walking in the green areas, walk in the yellow, walk in the red. Is this the area you want to spray? Where is your cutoff for putting down a fungicide? That information can then be cross-referenced with the NDVI, and then we can use those NDVI values to then create as a threshold to create your fungicide prescription. After the flight, you've decided to create the fungicide. There's a few data layers that we need. So obviously the NDVI imagery, but we can also use other field health images as well. We do like to stress or advise doing some ground truthing to verify your NDVI index. So what essentially is your spray threshold? Are you spraying half the field, a quarter of the field? Where are you actually putting down your fungicide? As Aaron mentioned, we need to know the application rate. So they found that they had more success with the 22 gallons, but some guys like to go around 20 to 25 as well for some crops. We need to know the sprayer width, the combine width. This is used for creating grids for our check blocks, for the Deveron blocks. We also need to know the sprayer monitor. That's going to be used in the tractor. Can it actually control your rate? Can it turn it on and off? But this is also really important when we make prescriptions to ensure that we get you the right format. Because if it's the wrong format, the script's not going to work, going to be frustrated, slow you down, won't be able to get you in the field.
Carl, I've got a question.
Yes.
If one of our partners or folks that are listening that works with farmers and they have experience with monitors and are fairly comfortable using software, are we able to work with them and let them do some of the work as well?
Very much so, yep. We can create the script, hand it off, and let our partners do the rest of the work, whether it's uploading it or working hand in hand with the grower. We're here in the background to support in any way that the partners or any of our clients need. So if they need support, we're there to support them, walk them through it. If they can handle it, great. We let them take care of that.
For those of you who have staples in your backyard, we are the easy button. So nobody has taken us up on our offer to make your life more difficult, but a lot of people have taken us up on our offer to make your life easier.
That's true. Thank you. And then just lastly, we just need to know your AB lines. That goes along with creating the check blocks. This slide just showing you the steps. So on the left is the in-season NDVI. This field you can see has a bit more variability. We then, after ground truthing, we then create management zones. And then we create that into the on-off prescription. Green is on and red is the off prescription. You'll see on the right the grid lines. So that's what I was talking about on the previous slide of knowing your sprayer width, your combine width, and also the AB lines. So we make sure the prescription's lined up with the side of the field that you'll be starting on, but also to the size of your equipment. We also use these grids for putting in the check blocks. The check blocks we call Bear blocks here. That is what we use for the data insights, the validation of your prescriptions at the end of the season. The Vera blocks allow to do plot research on a field scale. There's no extra work for the grower. The monitor does all the work. They do all the adjusting. You just need to activate the prescription and away you go. The Vera blocks allow for analysis of looking at the ideal target rate. So whether the ideal target rate in each zone. So should I apply 20? Should I have done 25? Should I do 30? Play around with your rates in each yield zone. We can also look at the ideal target rate for product comparison if you want to do that in your field as well. We can also look at the yield impact or the benefit to your yield, the return on investment, but also just do a basic product comparison within the yield with that impact on the product comparison in your field with the impact on the yield. So looking at a fungicide by productivity zone and the yield benefit, in this field, in this example, we just put random on-off blocks throughout the field. In this trial specifically, they used Preaxor. Green is the on, red is the off. We then overlaid that onto a yield map, which was then created into a high, medium, and low productivity area. Green is the high, red is the low productivity. And you can see if that treatment actually had a yield bump. And what we found was that there was a 9.8 bushel per acre increase in the high productivity zone just by putting the fungicide down. There was a positive increase in the yield for all productivity areas, but the high productivity had the greatest impact. And then overall, we took the cost of the application and the product and also the cost of the seed at market. And there was the best return was just in the high productivity of over $17 an acre increase just on that area. So the takeaway from here is, yes, there was a little bit of an increase. Maybe you could have just got away with applying the high productivity areas and not worried about the lower one to help save some cost there.
If I remember this field correctly, I think this was a fairly high fertile farm, and I do believe this was a year that we had a lot of adequate moisture in soybeans. So for those of you who remember or didn't fall asleep while I was talking about disease cycles, this was a perfect example of where white mold was rearing its ugly head.
So this is a good example of a disease management over stress management.
Correct. Yes.
Okay. So this one here is another example on soybeans. As Aaron said, we have a lot of our experience in soybean fields. So this is another step process of the NDVI in the fields, how we just created a basic on-off prescription, and then we put in check blocks in each area just to do the analysis at the end.
Carla, did the farmer want to put a check strip in as well? It looks like they wanted to compare different systems.
Yes, they also did that on their own.
So if you don't like the check blocks and you want to stick with the check strips, that is also an option.
Yes, so they did both in this field by chance.
Excellent.
That's just how they're used to it, so they can add it in and we can do the analysis at the end for them too. So this just is some data insights from on the statistician's side, but this one was looking at different fungicide, looking at individual applications of Acapella, Cotegra, Preaxor, but then also looking at some multiple passes of Cotegra, Acapella, or Cotegra and Preaxor. So this one showed that Preaxor had the best ROI in the high and low production zones, but no treatment was the best course of option in the medium production zone on the farm. In the same year, in the same region, similar trials were done, and a completely different fungicide showed the better ROI in 3 production zones, and I think that one was Acapella. So this is just an example to show you that study the fungicide on multiple fields helps manage each field's needs differently. Just don't blanket apply the same product across every field because it may not work.
Carla, that's a great point. Like if you think about it, every field is unique, right? And that's what makes agriculture so much fun.
Yeah.
So taking a blanket statement and saying Preaxor will work everywhere on every year is probably not going to be that great. Likewise, Acapella, I've worked with some growers that absolutely love working with Acapella. So it really depends on their experience. And some of the stuff that we're working on with the data team is to understand, is there soil fertility reasons why Preaxor is working better than Acapella in certain areas?
Yeah, and I should point out too, we're not sure what the varieties were in these fields, so there could be a varietal difference as well. But also the underlying, what was applied for fertilizer, what was the soil fertility, things like that, we're not really sure. This is just a basic looking at the different fungicide treatments on each field, and just to show that which treatment had the best ROI overall this year. And this is a similar example where we were just looking at the overall ROI of a fungicide on edible beans. So this was last year, this field had very low disease pressure. Actually, there's a little bit that came on near the end of the year, but it ultimately was a low disease pressure year. So this was more of a stress management for them than anything last year. And this had a $148 profit for them, just looking at the fungicide application.
Well, that's interesting because you can see, Carla, the headlands were definitely the most stressed. And as much as we talk about fungicides being able to really reduce stress, there's a certain point where fungicides, they're not a magic bullet, right? And you can see that in the headlands.
Yeah, so there was still a little bit better increase, but you won't get that same benefit from the headlands. You're right.
You and I were talking about if we don't get rain around here this weekend, oh boy, we got trouble.
This one is slightly different. This is an example of fungicide treated seed on corn, actually. So we broke the field down by low productivity area, which is the green, and is pink, the red, I guess, and green is the high productivity area. And the seed was treated with Fortenza. So then we put the check blocks of treated seed and untreated seed. The lime green or the light green is the treated or the untreated blocks, and then the pink is the treated throughout the field.
This is a really cool trial. It's very complicated. I believe there was a specialized planter involved. It was a multi-hybrid planter,
Yes.
right?
Yeah, so this was just tested with a seed company and a grower that they work very closely with.
Yep. So anyone who's listening to us today, if you've got some advanced technology that you want to be able to really push the envelope with, please reach out. We'd love to have a chat. And for those of you that are agronomy geeks, I believe Fortenza is actually a insecticide in this particular case. But what wasn't labeled, and hats off to Carla for keeping things somewhat confidential on this trial, is there was a new seed treatment with a new fungicide at play here as well. So we had to disguise it a little bit. So don't be thinking that we don't understand the difference between insecticides and fungicides, folks.
So at the end, overall, there was a 12.78 bushel an acre or 0.86 ton a hectare advantage to having that treated seed last year in the field.
You know everybody's going to ask us what that new fungicide is now.
I'm not answering.
Yeah, that is smart. Good answer.
So this is just another example of the deeper insights that we can provide looking at comparison of the treatment. You'll see that statistically significant advantage to the treated area. So those are the higher lines that you can see in the top graph that had the positive impact. And then also the bottom graph, it's a box plot. And what you want to look at is that the range of data points is greater in the blue or the teal colored, and that's the untreated area, and pink is the treated area. The data points are a lot tighter, and there was a positive yield impact there.
So it looks like it's reducing the variability.
Variability as well, yes.
Very cool.
So just wrapping up, it's key to understand the pressures in your field. Is it disease related? Is there stresses from the weather, or is there underlying issues? And also timing of your fungicide, as Aaron reviewed, it is important to make sure you get the fungicide on in the right areas at the right time. And even in low disease pressure years, fungicide does still have a positive impact on yield and your ROI. Protect the crop that you do have, just in case the weather turns against you and you have that on your side. And field-specific NDVI paired with your strong analytics help answer your so what's. The prescriptions with the checkbox help verify your applications and your ROI, and also helps with the 4R compliance.
So for those of you who support and work with farmers, great opportunity to be able to build a valuable relationship with them to make sure that they understand what the value is that you are bringing to their operation in a hard set return on investment numbers. So with that, we are going to pass things back to our lovely Vanna White. Those of you that are younger might not get that joke, but she's still around. Perfect. So our host, Scott Jackman. So we are going to be passing that back to Scott. And Scott, you are now in control.
All right. Thanks, Aaron. Thanks, Carla. I appreciate it. I appreciate the knowledge you were able to pass on, and let's get to the part where we're going to answer some questions. And earlier on, somebody had said that my audio was a bit of a mess, and I hope I have been able to fix it now. If my audio remains a mess, somebody type over there that it's bad, and I'll turn it back over to Aaron. But in lieu of that, Daniel did have one bit for conversation before we get into the Q&A. He was asking, where are you located? And his reference point was the 2012 drought in central Illinois, which generally encompassed the major corn belt. What was your experience with the major droughts, and what region are you coming from?
So Daniel, I'll take that first. We're located, myself personally, I'm located just outside of Detroit. So we get hit with the Great Lakes tend to influence our weather fairly significantly. So when you guys are dry in central Illinois, that wind goes across the Great Lakes, and we get a bunch of rain. So 2012 was a really good year for us.
It was a very hot year too, though. It was way above normal in CHU accumulation. For here, we were about 37 to 38, I think, that summer. So I think we started out really dry, and then I think it rained in the August.
For those of you who don't know, Carla used to work for Weather Innovations Network, so she's our resident weather expert. So she makes sure that we're not telling fibs about what the weather was like. But to answer your question, Daniel, on a drought year that you experienced in 2012, and I would argue that we probably were we were stressed because we were so hot. I think you're right. It becomes more of a stress reducing year. Unless your fertility is through the roof, and then we're dealing with some white mold, but on certain crops, obviously.
Yeah, thanks, Aaron and Carla. And we are generally located across North America. Aaron and Carla running the data team are centrally located there, just east of Detroit, as he said. But we have collectors and partners and agronomists generally across the Midwest down into the South. Matter of fact, Dave Reinhardt is on the line here. He's actually in the panhandle of Texas, so and he's in a drought right now. So we've got a breadth of experience as far as where that goes. I see people are starting to ask the questions now. So if you would please, if you do have questions, go down and click that Q&A button and go ahead and type your question in there, and that way we can make sure we address it. I'll hit the first question, and then Aaron and Carla, if you could answer. We had a person comment about the CEUs. We'll get you added CEUs. Can you, and Aaron or Carla, can you just refresh us on the process for getting credit for the CEU credit for this?
If you email either myself or Carla, we will take care of it for you. Scott, if you can, I think you've got the last slide, Scott, maybe if you can share that.
Okay.
It actually has both Carla and I's email addresses. So if they would like to write those down, shoot us an email, or any other way to contact anyone else within the Deveron family, we'll make sure that you guys get your CEUs.
Thank you. Next question we have here is, why do you need to add the monopotassium phosphate? That was a point of comment you made earlier.
Yeah, I see that question is coming from Gene Sullivan. Gene, I would love to be able to answer that question. There's a little bit of a funny story behind that. My father farms as well, and he likes to use foliar fertilizers, and so we wanted to use a plant-friendly potassium that was dry because my father likes to minimize his costs, so he didn't want to pay for liquid, pay for that water. And so we went out and we tried it, and that was actually in 2010, and we had this huge response. So we started to try to replicate it and figure out exactly what was going on. And the biggest response and the most consistent response has been around that monopotassium phosphate, which is a similar molecule to monoammonium phosphate, which we all know as MAP. But it's a greenhouse grade. I wish I could offer an answer as to why it does it, and unfortunately I can't. One of the things we do know with monopotassium phosphate is it does have some fungicidal properties, specifically powdery mildew. It seems to beat up powdery mildew a little bit. We've never seen powdery mildew affecting yield, but for some reason it's a synergistic impact of having those two together.
Now, thanks, Aaron. This next question here, I'm actually going to break this next question into two parts, Aaron and Carla. So I'll ask the first question, answer it, and then we'll move on to the second part, but understand they're related. The first part of the question is, do either of you have any comments on the use of wide spectrum group N fungicides versus highly specific or more resistant risk fungicides?
All right, so I guess Group M, splitting them up, it really depends on what geographical area you're in for how you group different fungicides. But I'm understanding where the question's coming from. So your broad spectrum, they're offering a very protective, they're basically creating a protective layer. One of the crops that I used to have a lot of experience with is tomatoes. So a protective product, something like Bravo is the trade name that I'm familiar with, where you would have to spray every 6 days, and it basically creates a layer that the fungus does not get into the plant. Great option if you're going after disease control, but that broad spectrum product is not going to do a great job on that stress reducing part. The translaminar stuff, that is where you're going to have that that plant health. At least that's been my experience on it. I think that answers the question. I know there's a second part to it, Scott. So if you want to ask that second part.
Yeah, I will. And this series of questions is from Vikram Bish. The second part of the question is, do you have any comments now that some companies are recommending using a half-rate fungicide along with an herbicide spray?
I always get very skittish around cut rates, simply because when you start doing cut rates, you're setting in my experience is you're setting yourself up for more or like higher likelihood of resistance developing. So in general, I'm not in favor of it. Yeah, you know what? I'm just going to stick with saying that I struggle with making that recommendation.
Yeah, thanks. And that goes right back to our on-off rate for not using necessarily a variable rate application, but an on-off rate application. This question from David goes back to the monopotassium phosphate. He's asking how much monopotassium phosphate in the spray mix. Is there a gallon per acre rate for reference to talk about?
Yeah, for that one, about 1 kilogram.
So yeah, so that's the metric version now. He's talking about gallons. So just over 2 pounds per acre. So the monopotassium phosphate that I've worked with is a dry product. But I'm sure there's a liquid version. And the company that's selling you the foliar probably has their recommended rates there.
Yeah, thanks. Next question is from Laura Keith. This question is surrounding no-till fields, and she's asking, do no-till fields with fungicides applied have more residue in the soil fungus? Can you talk about the bacteria ratio? Is it lowered if you get a fungicide application? What's the soil fungus versus bacteria ratio? Can you talk about that a little bit?
Scott, I have to compliment you on the quality of people you invite to these, because these questions are incredible. So that question, let's see. Do the no-till fields with fungicides applied regularly have more residue of soil fungus to bacteria ratios? All right, so okay, there's a couple pieces here. My background, Papa Brimer, my father started no-tilling in 1986. So I was born and raised that no-till is the answer to everything. Not fully on board with my father these days, but do have some experience on no-till. So first thing, no-till in general tends to reduce disease. Not so much on the residue or on the stress reducing part, but just because it reduces the amount of canopy. So the plants are smaller, less bushy. Thank you, Carla. Carla's whispering in my ear to make sure I answer the question correctly. So because of that, you have less, in the case of white mold, being reintroduced back into the soil. Then the other part of that, once again, it depends on the disease and that disease cycle. So for example, if you're dealing with edible beans, there's a very large family disease called anthracnose that tends to be soil borne. Well, how it often gets infected is by splash of large raindrops depositing soil onto the leaf surface. So in that particular case, no-till is probably going to reduce that a little bit. However, if you've got no-till residue sitting there that is acting as a reservoir of disease because the last year that disease was on that plant, and I'm thinking in the case of no-till corn on corn, or even reduced tillage corn on corn, you set yourself up. And I'm sure there's some diseases that probably do harbor on both corn and soybeans. Off the top of my head, I'm not sure which ones, but there could be some issues there. So great question, Laura. I'm going to go with my standard answer when it gets into these great questions is it depends. So there is value to it depending on your situation.
I love it whenever somebody can stump us here. Next question here is from David Makar, sorry. What are your thoughts on fungicides with regards to cereal crops, such as wheat, barley, oats? So have you seen yield bumps there? And how does crop staging, how do you use crop staging for maximum effectiveness on this?
So great question, David. My experience on wheat to date has been, or on cereals, let's just go with small cereals, has been very heavily towards wheat, specifically winter wheat. I have recently gained some experience with winter barley. So to date, I don't think we've got any solid case studies that show that fungicides are reducing stress in small cereals. There's no doubt in my mind that if there's disease there, my father grows some oats, and yes, you'll find that I like to pick on my father a lot, but rust in oats has been a big problem. For those of you who are plant pathology geeks, there's something called the Puccinia pathway that brings up a bunch of rust spores into our area, so we get hit with that. So oats has been a problem on that side. Barley, the winter barley and the winter wheat, it's really weather dependent. The other thing we didn't really talk about that fungicides can do is improve quality.
Seed quality, yeah. Yeah,
because being in the Great Lake Basin, some of the folks that don't have experience in the Great Lakes, we've got fusarium diseases that cause a lot of grain quality problems, both in wheat and corn. It forms a vomitoxin called, I don't know what the big long name is, but we just know what it's done, right?
Denoxin, something.
That's way better than I would.
Non-toxin.
Yes.
Non-toxin.
So when you get into stuff like that, it has a really big impact on the quality side.
Which we found it's about a 3-day window for best application around pollen stage for winter wheat. Similar with corn around tassel, and you have about a 3-day window for best application there and control.
Yeah, I forgot you guys did at your previous employer. You guys did a lot of modeling work on when was the best time to control those types of diseases. So very weather dependent. So we're going back to the disease triangle.
Yeah, thanks, guys. This next question, and I thought we were running out of questions, and then we got a good bunch of them. So we're going to try to get through as much of these as we can. Next question is from our favorite person, anonymous attendee. We always get him to come back. Do you use white mold inoculation monitoring along with other disease risk forecasting to recommend timing for soybeans or other sensitive crops, maybe canola, field beans?
So I would look more at, for myself, looking at the cropping history and what the disease history is. I believe sclerotia has been found to be able to stay viable in the soil for up to 20 years. So that's going back quite a ways. So am I actually looking to see how much sclerotia are out there? Probably not, but I'm looking at, okay, what is the cropping history? And some of the anecdotal evidence that we've seen so far is that the white mold has a strong correlation to soil fertility levels. Now that's anecdotal, and being in the data science group here within Deveron, we don't really like anecdotal, so this is one of the big areas that we're looking to improve on. So to answer your question, very much looking at making sure, or going back to that disease triangle, what is the level of inoculum from past experiences?
Awesome, thank you. Next question from Jack Vandewoestein. Was the 22 gallon per acre of water rate only for soybeans, or is it for corn also?
That's a great last name. Definitely a Dutch last name. After my own heart on that. That 22 gallons, I'm going to say at this point that is on soybeans. That is where we've been able to conclusively determine that. I have seen lots of good response on fungicide with corn applied aerially, and they are not going anywhere near 22 gallons. They're going anywhere from, I think the low end I've seen is 2 up to 5 gallons. So it becomes a coverage thing too, and it depends on the crop. So the 22 gallons, that is a soybean statement.
Great. Next question is from Kurt Metzger. Any work with alfalfa for prescriptions?
Yes, on boron is nothing on. Oh no, I lied. I forgot. We did do some work with BASF's either headline or pre-actor. I'm not sure which one. And it was, I believe, after first cut alfalfa, and we found. We were doing some work with a harvest lab equipped forage harvester, and we were able to see quality greatly improve, especially in the stressed areas. So if you're doing the work with alfalfa for dairy, and you're looking at some of the digestibility numbers, there's definitely a tie-in there. Now, to be fair, I think it was one field. And then we've also done a bunch of stuff, when I say a bunch of stuff, I want to say 3 or 4 fields with foliar boron on alfalfa.
But we're always willing to test and try out the different crops too, just so we can gain that extra knowledge for both the growers and ourselves too. So if you have some fields you want to try, please get in contact with us, and we'd be happy to work with you through that.
And as we're rolling down, I think we have one question left. If you do have a burning question that you have not typed in yet, go ahead and do so, because after we get through with this last question, we will wrap it up for the day. The last question comes from one of our strong partners down in the Texas Panhandle, Dave Reinhardt. Dave is asking, is there an advantage to using fungicide applications following hail damage? And we know they had a big round down there lately.
So the answer, David, and I suspect I can see David smiling as I'm going to answer this, is because he knows the answer on this, is it depends. It depends on how severe that hail was. I've had cases of fields that had a very minor hailstorm go through that opened up some infection points. And also caused some stress to the corn, and we've seen I think in the range was it was on corn between 10 and I want to say the top end was just shy of 30 bushels per acre. However, if the hailstorm that went through has stripped the corn down to the stalk and there ain't nothing left, once again, fungicides, they're a great product, but they're not going to be able to reverse something like that. So the answer to that question is minor hail, yes. Intermediate to significant hail, I would be calling my crop insurance folks and cutting my losses at that point. Now, what's always interesting is when you do have a severe hailstorm go through, usually on the periphery, the edges of the storm, there'll be a little bit less damage. So if you're in those fields or parts of those fields, maybe you can add a little bit more value depending on how your crop insurance arrangement works.
All right. Oh, we got snuck in there. Got 2 more questions come in right in the end. So we'll hit this next hail question. What about hail on seed corn? Any thoughts there? Hail on seed corn.
Ooh. Who asked that question? Because we're actually in the seed corn area, and what was that? 2 years ago when we had a massive hailstorm go through.
Yeah, this was Douglas, Novarisk.
All right, so we had a really severe hailstorm. So once again, it comes down to how severe the damage is. Seed corn companies are going to have to make that call. I'm willing to bet that if it's affecting a significant number of their acres of one of their more popular varieties, they're going to do everything under the sun to try to bring back that crop and try to get something out of it. So it really depends on the value of that hybrid, or the inbreds of that the resulting hybrid is going to be for them. If it's a company that has that's well diversified all across the North America, and they're like, we've got it in other areas, they might be more apt to write it off.
All right. And I think this will, oh, another one got in here. Kenneth Farman is asking, what are your thoughts on using boron with corn fungicide at tasseling to help with seed setter development?
Biggest thing with boron is you want to make sure, the first big thing with boron, especially at that timing, is you want to make sure that it's at a very plant safe version of boron. The biggest chunk of boron that goes out in the fields is either like, it's basically a borax, which is an extremely high pH. So you apply that and you're going to burn the living stuffing out of your corn. Don't use that stuff. Using a much more plant-friendly version, I actually like it, especially if your soil tests and or tissue tests are showing that you're limited in boron. Some of these situations where you're going to see limited boron is going to be the similar soils where you see sulfur or nitrogen challenges as well. Boron does leach, so if you're dealing with a sandy soil and it lives in the organic matter, so sandy soil or low organic matter soils, those are cases where you're going to see a lot of boron limitations. We've got a bunch of guys this year that are putting boron in with their side dressing on corn in order to get that boron there. So if boron is a yield limiting factor, 100% on board with being able to improve that pollination.
I know we've seen some yield increase just from pre-plant application as well.
Yep.
Doing a boron followed by nitrogen and then a plant, we have seen some pretty good yield benefits with that on that application.
Perfect.
Yeah, thank you. And then the last comment here, it's not really a question, it was commenting back to the seed corn. This is from Robert Burris. Yes, they had severe hail damage on seed corn a couple years ago, and they did indeed spray fungicide to protect it. The harvested yield had reasonable yield and reasonable quality, and then he says partially due to fungicide ? So.
Yep. Both Carl and I know Bob Buis quite well. So, yeah, he knows exactly the storm that we were talking about. And Bob is an agronomist for one of the local seed seed production companies. Yeah, he would have had a nice bit of experience. The heart of that storm that I'm thinking of, there was, like, some of the tomato plants, there was nothing left. Like, it wasn't even a stick that was left. I would imagine if we talked to Bob, if he had any of those fields that stripped down to nothing, it probably didn't give much of an effect. But when we were on the outer periphery of it, I suspect, kind of knowing, because I used to work in that area very closely with some of Bob's farmers, that there were probably some fields that they were able to get a little bit of benefit to save some of it.
Yeah, great. And he just did comment 1,200 acres in Dover. Hey, everybody, we appreciate all your great questions. I love it when you can stump Carla and Aaron. We will continue this educational series through the growing season, and we'll probably even do some into the winter for whatever's up for the decision that's upcoming. We'll continue on with our series. We appreciate it. All of our webinars are recorded, so we do go back and upload these to our YouTube site, and we also upload these to our podcast on Precision Ag Made Easy. So if you go to YouTube and search Deveron UAS, you'll see our YouTube channel in there, and in there is all of our past webinars. And if you go to precisionagmadeeasy.com, that's our podcast, and all of our podcasts, some plus some other original content remains over there. So we appreciate all your questions, all your comments, and look forward to continue on growing our increasing the adoption rate of precision ag. We appreciate everybody. Thank you, and have a great day. Good luck.